Test. Hey YouTube. I'm once again bereft of topic, really. Um, One of the things I wanted to talk about, or I thought about talking about, is there's a channel that King and Queen of the Cichlids brought up with his premiere the other night. Um, the Mad Aquarist. I think that he is an older school guy, and I should probably add, hey, the Fish Loft, welcome to the stream. Is the audio okay? Um, I should add a URL to his channel. It looks like it's only been open for like 3 weeks, but I think he is someone that it's going to be worth your time to check out. Hey Pam, welcome to the stream. There, I think I've got that in the description now, and I can put it in the I definitely would check him out. Pam, I caught a little bit of hey Corona Kid, welcome to the stream, glad to see you make it. I caught a little bit about you had some kind of issue in Joseph's stream. I didn't catch it live, but I watched some of it, and people were talking like you had some kind of problem or something. I'm not sure exactly what was going on. I couldn't quite get the gist of it, but I hope everything's all right for you. Anyway, I would definitely check out the Mad Aquarist. He's already interviewed a Pleco guy and Daniel and the Central American cichlid chipper guy, Rich, I think his name was. He had some beautiful fish in his fish room. And Mike Drawdy at Imperial Tropicals. And people that have been around the hobby for a long time have a lot of different friends and know a lot of different people that are, important people in the hobby. And so it's always good when someone like that does live streams, because they can call on their friends to, or they're in a situation where they can easily access people to interview and talk to about fish keeping that are people that get called to clubs, speak at conferences. And it's always good when you can have those kind of people in a behind the scenes interview by someone who knows something about fish. Hey Cobweb Caverns, welcome to the stream, man. So I would definitely check him out. He may not be your cup of tea. His delivery methodology may not be your cup of tea, but I think he's someone that's worth keeping an eye on and watching his videos. He says that he was a trained botanist, that when he went to school that's mainly where he studied what he studied. But I think I've met the guy once before, long ago, and because I kind of recognize him. but I don't know that that's true, and I'm sure he wouldn't remember me even if we had met. But when I first looked at his face, I felt like I recognized him, probably at some talk for a club in Texas or maybe somewhere else. um, the other thing that's been kind of on my mind in the last week or so um, is archaeoichthyology. And that's basically the study of fish bones. And it is because one of my passions that I try to keep up with and follow is archaeology. And basically it's digging up old sites from humans, going back 600,000 to 700,000 years, um, and they most of the stuff has become fossilized by long ago by then, and so mostly what they're dealing with is fossils. There are some tools and chips and some things like that that really aren't fossilized, but one of the ways that they can get a picture on what kind of culture the people had and what they were eating is by finding bones of animals that were food animals, bones that have been worked on by a tool and left marks, and also by fish bones. And fish have very, very, very small bones. Fish don't really have large bones of any sort. And it's pretty easy to see why. Um, it's fish really aren't subject to gravity. Most mammals and most um, birds and the like are subject to gravity, and so their bone structure has to be more dense. And birds are probably not a good choice because birds have hollow bones, most of them. But anything that walks and crawls on the ground a lot is going to have heavier bone structure because it's dealing with gravity. And fish live in the water. And in salt water, they have even more buoyancy. But even in fresh water, they're very buoyant. So their bone structure can be much more delicate. They don't have to have really robust bone structures. And bone structures are also a way in ichthyology to tell about the evolutionary processes that have occurred with our fish. We can say, where do our fish come from? And in saying that, we can mean a geographical location. But we can also say, where do our fish come from, and mean an evolutionary pathway that has occurred for those fish. Rufus, are you okay, mister? Goodness.
He's been doing that quite a bit.
Yeah, he must be having some kind of allergies or something. Anyway, it's possible to determine where on the evolutionary track or graph that fish come from a lot by their bone structures, by the size of the hole that the uh, spinal cord passes through in the vertebrae of fish. Fish have rather small vertebrae. Of course, there are larger types of fish that have larger vertebrae, and fish like sharks, many of the cartilaginous fish, who don't really have a lot of bone structure, but instead have a lot of cartilage. They will have cartilage structures that take the place of vertebrae that are bones. And the older a fish is, the further back you go, you will be able to see a larger hole in their vertebrae for their spine to pass through, and they will have more vertebrae. The more modern a fish is, the less vertebrae it will have. And part of that is because the vertebrae get morphed and evolve into other structures, and so there's less and less vertebrae on the spinal cord, and more of them are used for other kinds of structures instead. So in archaeology, it's it's really hard sometimes to find fish bones, and mostly what they find are vertebrae or perhaps a skull, and they're used to tell what kind of food sources this particular group of people were accessing, and maybe even trade, so that these early peoples were living 200 miles from any water source that would have these fish in it. Hey, Daryl Dimer, welcome to the stream. But but yet they were trading with people that lived far enough away that they were near a water source and could catch fish. So that's kind of how archaeoichthyology comes into play with basic archaeology, because there are a lot of sites where there are fish middens, and that's like a pile of fish that bones and skins that the people were discarding, and sometimes they'll find those on coastlines. There's also shellfish middens, and all of these things give us a picture of what those fish were like in that time period. And like I say, there's not a lot of fossilized cartilage and cartilage fish, but there are quite a few. And the study of the evolutionary process of fish is a really remarkable path to follow. Um, Hagfish were one of the earliest uh, vertebrates to have a spine and a spinal cord passing through it, and basically all things, mammalian and otherwise, that have a spine and a spinal cord passing through it all progressed from there and went through countless versions of, once they reached the evolutionary stage of fleshy um, lobes on their fin structures, like the coelacanths. Those have fleshy areas that look like fins, and then the rays of the fins on the lower portion, they actually developed into limbs when those creatures in some evolutionary form ventured out onto the land as dinosaur-like creatures. And literally there are over and over again cases of creatures moving out of the oceans onto the land, and then after a certain period on land moving back into the oceans again. And that's where we get a lot of the diversity that goes on in the fish species, is because there have been so many different changes. And fish species make up more than 25,000 species on the planet Earth, much more than all of the other types of creatures, animals, and mammals, and all of them don't make up 25,000 species on their own. So fish are a highly speciated species. In other words, there are a lot of different kinds. And now that DNA testing is becoming a norm in ichthyology, we are discovering more and more species because even though they appear to be the same pretty much on the, by the skin, by the scales, by the body shapes, by the fins. Hey, Big E's, welcome to the stream. On a molecular level, there are differences in the DNA. And in ichthyology, with the fish keeping hobby, there has been a constant tug of war between lumpers and splitters, which is what Axelrod called them. And there are people that are trying to pull large groups of fish together into one group instead of all these differing groups. There are a lot of ichthyologists that are lumpers. They want to take all these varied and widely varied species that have been split all up, and they want to lump them all together under one species name. And there are...
As a side note, those two groups exist in every branch of botany and zoology.
The lumpers and the splitters.
Yes, yes.
My wife's saying that even in botany there's lumpers and splitters. And that's true. And then you've got the splitters who are using things like DNA and fish that are almost exactly the same, but are from different locations. It's a fish further downstream that has some slight color variation. And one of the reasons why there are so many different species of fish, and I thought it was interesting because when the Mad Aquarius was interviewing Mike Drotti, and I've heard Mike say this before as well, he recently went to a trip in Indonesia, a collecting trip, and he was just stunned by how many different species of rainbows there were in that little area of Indonesia where they were. And then he began to recognize that part of what was going on was that they were walking through the jungle and that they would come on a mountain range or a large hill range, if you want to put it like that. And there would be a stream coming off of one side of that hill, and it would only go maybe half a mile until it dumped out and went underground or dumped out somewhere where it was no longer continuing. And that they would find one species of rainbow in that little half a mile stretch of that stream. And if they crawled over the hill or the mountain and went down the other side, they would find another half a mile stretch stream that was also another different species. And so what's going on in the environment is that the environment creates all these different types of areas where there's mountains, where there's lots of big hills, where there are river systems that break up into large areas, where there are flooding seasons that cross over top of all kinds of waterways and raise the water level really high over a very large area. There are all kinds of ways that different species are required because one type of fish very early on managed to end up into that larger stream or river that then, because of plate tectonics and hills and mountains rising up, got broken in half. And because of that, the fish species on this side evolved one way, and the fish species on this side evolved another way. And this goes on all through the geological record, where the rift lakes were formed in Africa, or where the supercontinent of Gondwanaland broke up into all the major continents that we see in the world in this day and age. Land masses are continually moving. They are continually uplifting. They are continually falling because of plate tectonics and places where one plate is being, what's the word, subsumed by another, and that plate goes down underneath this plate, and it will in turn raise an edge of the plate that's being gone underneath of. So the ground is literally raising. Every year they do another measurement on Mount Everest, and it is continually rising. It is going up. And the reason why is the chunk of tectonic plate that was India crashed into the area that is Tibet and southern parts of China and Bhutan. All those places are on the rising side of the plate that had India on it, that is being pushed underneath and forcing the Mount Everest area to continue to rise. So that kind of change is occurring all the time in our world. Right now, one of the things that's going on is that waterways are drying up everywhere across the world because of raised heat in our atmosphere, because there are a lot of different reasons. The water being used by people for drinking water. There are a lot of different reasons why a lot of waterways in the world are drying up. And by the same token, as the ice melts in our Arctic and glaciers like in Greenland and Iceland, the water level of the ocean is rising, and that will eventually start taking over freshwater estuaries where rivers dump out, and pretty soon all that water will be salt water instead of a mix or freshwater. So there's all kinds of ways that new species of fish, that they are being pressured into existence by the way that tectonic plates operate on the planet, by the effect of different weather conditions. There are a lot of things that have created those 25,000 species of fish, and nobody knows that's the exact number. New species of fish are being discovered every day, and by that token, new species of fish are dying out every day as well. So it's kind of an amorphous number. It's a guesstimate at best, but it keeps getting a little closer every year. You know, the ichthyologists and the scientists and the collectors all kind of work together to add to the knowledge base about our fish that we keep in our hobby, or that we want to keep in our hobby, or that need to be kept by fish keepers worldwide to keep them alive because their habitat being destroyed before they're even really discovered. So there are a lot of different ways that the science of fish keeping spreads out. There are a lot of different fields, even under the heading of ichthyology. There are a lot of different kinds of ichthyology and a lot of different ways to look at the study of fish. the study of ancient fish, the study of modern fish. There are a lot of different. Uh, it's always been a thought of mine that eventually we will have a good enough understanding of the evolution of certain species of fish that we will literally be able to trace Gondwana land back together in a very close, right now it's still just kind of a rough picture of how Gondwana land split apart. We don't have any pictures from back then to tell us exactly what the continents look like when they split apart. But you should be able to trace actual tectonic plate movement and migration of fish species and evolution of those fish species. Hey, Kaler's Aquatics, welcome to the stream. Yeah, only 6 watching. I'm ranting about a subject that probably not a lot of people are really interested in today. So I can understand why some of them might find something better to watch or to listen to. But I just feel like that these are all bits and pieces of what we call the fish keeping hobby, the fish keeping pastime, as Imes called it. And even if we don't really spend a lot of time studying deeply into these areas, it doesn't mean that there is not evidence of it going on in the fish that we have in front of us. And Pam, you're a nerd after my own heart. Then, if archaeology is something that fascinates you, then or ichthyology or archaeoichthyology is a subject that fascinates you, there is a wealth of information out there. I spent a big part of this morning watching archaeoichthyology presentations at a UK university, and it's really remarkable. If it's a lot of information for you to be able to know all the bones in a fish's body of a certain evolutionary time is really difficult. It's really a lot of, it's almost medical science, basically, but medical science on fish. And that's a lot of information to take in to try to learn all those different bones. But that's only going to be really handy to you if you're on archaeological digs and you're suddenly faced with a bone you don't recognize. And there's not a lot of fish bones that come to light in archaeological digs because it has to be the right kind of soil for them to survive. Fish bones are very thin, they're very tiny, and they don't always get sifted out of the dirt. They just become part of the dirt because archaeologists really aren't looking for tiny splinters of fish bones sometimes. But sometimes they do. Sometimes they find whole middens, and like maybe where a group of hunter-gatherers caught 50 fish and cooked them all, and then the whole group sat down and ate fish and threw all the bones. Kaler says archaeology and ichthyology is fascinating. I follow several YouTube channels on the same. Yeah, I just, is it ever going to help me keep my fish alive? Maybe not. Maybe it's not ever going to actually be something that's eminently usable for me, but there is a really good chance that some of the information that I learned studying ichthyology subjects and archaeology, archaeoichthyology, may actually come into play when I'm starting to try to understand the behavior of a certain fish or identify a fish that otherwise I have no idea what is. It is possible that enough exposure to ichthyology may give me some clue, some understanding of fin ray count, some understanding, like the older a fish is on the evolutionary scale, the larger the distance is going to be between the pectoral fins and the ventral fins. You know, there are two pairs of fins, the ventral fins and the pectoral fins. The more modern a fish is on the evolutionary scale, the closer those two pairs of fins become and literally are one on top of the other in some very modern evolutionary scale. So if I find a pleco that has a really large distance between its ventral fins and its pectoral fins, then I automatically have an understanding that this is a fish that is further down the evolutionary scale. And you know, who's to say whether that's something that's actually and one of the things that got me started, you guys know I love books, and I love fish books. And one of the things that I do a lot of, you know, I don't go out and shop and buy a lot of stuff, but one of the places that I can be found is half-price bookstores or all these stores that open up that have tons of books that are, you know, left over and they're selling them for a song. Well, here's one that I picked up. This is the second edition of the encyclopedia here. Let me, if I'm going to talk about a book, I better give you a full screen. And this is the Encyclopedia of Fishes, a comprehensive illustrated guide by international experts. And I picked this one up for $5.99 is the price that's on the book, but it is mostly a lot of saltwater stuff, but there is necessarily a bunch of freshwater stuff. I mean, you're going to get information about all kinds of freshwater fish. You know, sometimes it's valuable information, sometimes it's marginally valuable information. But there's a whole section in here on classifying fishes and fishes through the ages. And this piqued my interest. I discovered this. It wasn't put up where it should have been. Let's see the name underneath that. The cephalospidiforms were distant relatives of the living hagfish and lampreys. Hemocyclaspis was a bottom dweller with a solid bony shield enclosing its head. These fish were jawless, had a single nostril, and possessed numerous gill pouches. And they were some of the first jawless fish. And that's really far back on the evolutionary scale. So, you know, you're gonna learn things that maybe aren't perfectly useful It's got a section on endangered species, which is something we should all part two of the book is kinds of fishes. So there are a lot of different, they've got the coelacanth in there, lungfish. Anyway, looking at this book, because I haven't seen it for quite a while, it was stuck with a stack of books that weren't someplace that I'm normally digging in, or they weren't put up with my other fish books. But that is the sort of thing that piques my interest again, and I started once again digging into archaeoichthyology, and I think that it's a fascinating subject. Several of the people here have actually said that they enjoy that kind of subject too, and as long as you can keep learning, as long as your mind is supple enough to keep taking in information and plugging it into what you already know, I think that we are less likely to become dementia cases, that we're less likely to become so stilted in our existence that we basically have just buried our head in the sand and don't want to pay attention to anything else anymore. I think that is a way of kind of staying young. At least your mind stays supple enough for you to continue to learn, to continue to be open to learning new information about subjects you love and about subjects you don't love. Sometimes the things we learn about that don't really seem important to us actually end up being really important to us. But that's all you can't point to one thing and say beforehand, this was really important that I learned this. But if you do learn it, maybe later on you can point back to it and say, wow, I'm really glad I learned that. I'm really glad I understood that then, so that I am able to use it now to look at other things. And that's kind of how I feel about ichthyology and archaeoichthyology. It gives us appreciation for the people who make their livelihood as marine biologists, as freshwater biologists, as vets that deal mainly with fish. There are a lot of people out there whose whole livelihood circles fish. It may be in the food industry, it may be in a research industry. There are whole testing facilities that are set up with thousands and thousands of tanks of one specific kind of fish, and a lot of times those are all on the same system, and they use them to test for drug interactions or test for how effective drugs are. And those people need people to keep those fish alive for them. Because if they're going to buy 50,000 of a certain species of fish, they don't want to have to go back out next week and buy them all over again. If they have a crash in their facility, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of starting over again. So they need to hire people that have the skills necessary to keep those fish alive, to understand how to keep a large system of a lot of tanks and a lot of water going. So there are all kinds of jobs out there that have to do with fish that don't have anything to do with the fish keeping hobby, but still produce information that is valuable to us as hobbyists. And I just think that we do ourselves, as fish keepers who want to improve our ability, I think we do ourselves a disservice when we try to avoid subjects like that, when we say, I don't want to know, turn the channel, I don't even want to know anything about this, you know, it's it's counterintuitive to me to avoid subjects that even peripherally relate to the subject that we have at hand that is our focus. Hey, Select Pet, welcome to the stream. All right, guys, that's 40 minutes of me preaching to you about. Kaylor's asking me, have I ever visited McKay's Books in Knoxville? Yes. I lived in Knoxville for about 10 years. And I always went to the. And Knoxville is where my first fish keeping experience as an adult or semi-adult came from, because I was going to UT, and one of the people that was a buddy of mine that was going to UT, he was going home for the summer, and he had a fish tank, and he basically showed up at my house. I lived off campus. I knew better than to live on campus. It was too expensive. But he was on a scholarship that paid for where he lived. Yes, Knoxville is in Tennessee. Go Vols, UT. Anyway, he said, look, Dwayne, I'm going home for the summer, and I don't have any place to put these fish. Will you keep them for me and bring them back? I'll come get them when I come back. Well, he left them with me, and he never came back. I never did figure out what happened with him. Knoxville's a gorgeous little town. It's got way too much traffic because everything basically funnels on one roadway. I was going to school at UT, and I was so broke I could barely rub two pennies together. And I was there in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and it was when, at that point in time, there was a place in Knoxville called Malfunction Junction, which was where, I think it's I-75 and I-40 literally became one lane. There was a place where all trucks going east or west on I-40 and all trucks going north and south on I-75 literally had to get in one lane. And because of that, there were certain periods of the day where you could literally sit for 4 hours in traffic if you were out on one of the interstates near downtown. And so in the late 70s and early 80s, they completely redid all of the major thoroughfares through Knoxville, basically made them 8 lanes, and you could drive everywhere. But I remember the good old days when you could get stuck in traffic in Knoxville and be out there for 4 or 5 hours before it finally started opening up. If there was a wreck, one day I remember right there at Malfunction Junction, a truck full of cardboard boxes. You know, there's a lot of people that go away. Kaylor, I know, I built them. I worked for Southeast Bridge Builders, and we built most of those. I finally reached the point where I just couldn't see starving for college anymore. So I went back to work in construction, and went back to work with, that's when all that building was going on. And they were basically moving heaven and earth trying to find people that had any kind of construction experience to work for bridge builders, for pavers, for all of that. And I went to work for Southeast Bridge Builders and worked for a little over a year. But my father still has a house in Knoxville, still lives in Knoxville. My mom's down there. My brother and sister, actually, all three of my brothers and sisters are, yeah, I'm sure I did. The older I get, the more I tend to repeat myself. So I'm dependent on you guys to say, look, Dwayne, you talked about this last week. Shut up about it already. But I really loved living in Knox Patch because the time I was there, it was still not crowded enough to be just maniacal. The last 5 or 6 times I've been back, I couldn't wait to get out of there because of how crazy the traffic was. Even even with all the improvements, traffic is just maniacal at certain times of the day in Knoxville now. Because there's basically just one thoroughfare that runs all the way through the town. All right, guys, if you guys have any questions or subjects you want to bring up, I'm pretty much done with my rant. I just felt like it was important to broach this subject, uh, partly because it's something I've been thinking about a lot here lately and trying to catch as much information as I could off of YouTube. And there is a lot out there. If you want to study ichthyology in depth, if you want to study archaeoichthyology in depth, there is a ton of information. There are a ton of channels out there where you can go look at that kind of stuff. And the Mad Aquarius whose URL I put in, I definitely recommend looking him up. Select Pet says Knoxville was my getaway in college. I went to school on the Kentucky and Tennessee border. Yeah. Well, I had long ago moved out of the house. I'd basically been out of my parents' house. My father was a my way or the highway kind of guy, and I said, fine, I'll take the highway. So basically, since the age of 15, I've basically been out on my own because I really didn't want to do things his way. I wasn't going to do things his way. I did go back and live with my parents, my father and his wife for a while when I went back to school, and that was obviously not working well. So I moved out on my own. Well, actually, I had a couple of roommates. I moved out into a cheap apartment and a couple of roommates and did construction work on the side to try to put myself through school. But my buddies, my good friends that I'd known for a long time, um, they started avoiding me because they knew I was broke. If they were going to go see a show or go to the movies or something like that, they quit asking me because they knew I was broke and I couldn't afford to go. So they quit asking me to go. Hey, KG Cichlids, welcome to the stream. Um, so I went back to work. I just really felt like run off to Knoxville to get away from campus. One of the things I loved most about Knoxville, one of my friends, Joe Mayer, um, that is one of the few people in this life that I really have felt is a close friend to me. Um, and I haven't really spoken to him in years and years and years, but anyway, was one of the people that I really felt like was a simpatico friend of mine. He spent half of his time in the mountains around Knoxville. Um, and we would literally just grab some food, and on Friday after work or on whatever day after school, because we both went to school together and we were both working. Corona Ken, thanks for stopping by, man, and I hope you have a good day. I know you're about ready to start fishing regular again. I wish you good luck on your fishing, man. Um, Joe and I would basically just go to the mountains and spend all weekend up in the mountains. Joe knew the mountains around Cates Cove and that whole area like the back of his hand. Cobweb says, crush those half tables. Kaylor's you talking about Aquarium Knoxville, and that's your favorite to travel to live fish store. I don't remember any fish stores in Knoxville from the 80s or the late 70s. Um, by 81 or 82, I had already moved to Fort Worth and Dallas, Texas. But I don't remember any of the live fish stores in the early and late 70s in Knoxville. So I can't really put one to the other. Select Pets is next door to McKay Books. Now, which McKay Books is that? Is that the one that's in the mall? There used to be the McKay Books that I went to the most was in the mall, out. Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the road. Oh, that pizza place that everybody loved was right there. That local pizza place that everybody in Knoxville raved about in the 70s. I can't remember the name of it either. Had a red and yellow and white building. I don't know. I'll have to look it up. But this was a McKay's in a mall. Select Pet says, of course, in college, I was chasing girls more than fish. And I think that pretty much talks about all of us. All of us males and some females that are not heterosexual. We're probably all chasing girls in college. Okay, Kaylor says that it's he was when he moved back from Florida in 2000. It was there. Okay, that's probably a new location that I have no clue about. But there used to be like 3 McKay's Books that were in different malls all over Knoxville. There was one way out west, and there was one way east, and then there was one right downtown about 4 miles or 5 miles down from the college. After you went through all the fancy housing area on the main drag, and I can't remember the name of the main drag, and then you kind of came down a little hill and you opened up into an area where there was malls and restaurants and pizza places. In one of those malls there is where I remember McKay's Books. But yeah, I spend a lot of time in places like that. That's one of the things that will always catch my eye and make me want to stop is a large used bookstore, because I have an idea of the value of some of these fish books, and some of them are up in the hundreds of dollars. And if you can catch one for $10 or $5, man, you've made a heck of a steal, and you have a ton of useful information at hand. All right, guys, we've wandered our way through another hour, just about an hour, 54 minutes and 48 seconds. So unless anybody's got any last second questions or topics they want to discuss. Hey Joe from New Zealand, welcome to the stream, man. I didn't see you in earlier. I don't ever remember Punchy Pam talking about what was going on with her and the people were talking about in Joseph's stream either. I guess I'll catch that later on. All right, guys. I hope some of this information has been of value to you of some sort. And I wish you all good luck with your fish. Um, and I thank you for spending some of your time with me. There are a lot of different places on YouTube that you could be whiling away these hours at. And I do appreciate that a certain small cadre of you guys still hang with me, and I appreciate that greatly. I hope to be worthy of that interest in me. I know I'm all over the map, and sometimes the things I say aren't PC, but I really do have a passion for this hobby, and I love to talk about it. You guys have a good weekend.